welcome to our next lecture. Today we are going to talk about externalities. What externalities are about? They are classified as one of market failures, situations where market does not perform as we would like it to perform. This is the idea that some costs or some benefits may actually apply to someone outside of the market. So production and consumption, production or consumption can have external effects, external looking at the market. There are two types of externalities. One of them are called positive externalities. The other type is called negative externalities, or we sometimes refer to them as spillover benefits and spillover costs. Remember that externalities are market failures. Therefore, there is actually nothing positive in positive externalities. It's not that negative externalities are kind of worse than positive ones. No, externalities simply suggest market does not grasp all that we think it would. Think of an oil tanker disaster. Obviously, there are a lot of costs involved in this kind of disaster. So the ship itself is damaged or totally destroyed. The cargo may be lost or damaged. So there will be some costs to the ship owners, to someone who used to transport this cargo, or it could be also the case that there could be costs to insurance companies that insured, that provided insurance to the ship owner or the business that transports those goods. However, you can see there are a lot other costs that are not covered by private businesses. Beaches that got contaminated with oil, many dead animals, these are costs, but they are not private. They belong to the so-called social cost, which is a broader concept than just private costs. So what are externalities in fact? Look at the graph. You can see MB curve here, marginal benefit curve, that actually represents demand. Demand is connected to benefits that buyers can derive from goods they buy. MPC represents supply. It represents marginal costs, but actually this is marginal private costs that we are talking about. Normally, when we consider a market, we look at buyers and we look at sellers. We know that market equilibrium offers usually some producer surplus and consumer surplus, and we say the sum of those two, producer and consumer surplus, is defined as economic surplus, and this is the sum of the benefits that are kind of gained by the society, because we stress that both buyers and sellers, they both belong to the same society. So using economic surplus, we usually capture the benefits for the society coming from the market. What if society includes someone else, someone who's bearing additional external costs? Think of production, pollutions, and problems that other people may encounter. So let's imagine someone has a factory. This factory produces some good, but it also pollutes the river nearby. The production is offered to the market, so there are marginal benefits, demand for this good. There are marginal private costs, marginal cost of the business that produces this good, and we've got market equilibrium. This is what usually markets offer us. But there are some other costs connected with the pollution of the river. So when we look at the pollutions that are generated by this business, we see people who have to treat their water before they can drink it. So these are also the costs of production, but those costs are not paid by the business, they are paid by someone else. Hence, marginal social costs would be bigger than marginal private costs. If we look at private side of market, let's say private picture of the market, then we've got marginal benefits, marginal private costs, and the equilibrium that stems out of that. But actually, for the whole society, we should consider marginal benefits of those who buy those goods and marginal social costs of those who actually have to pay, have to cover those costs. This is not only the business that produces those goods, but also other people, like those who have to treat water before drinking. So the idea here is some of the costs are ignored by the market, and we should not ignore costs because it sends false signals. As you can see, in comparison to what market offers, this broader perspective suggests that actually the production should be smaller and prices should be higher. Prices should be higher because actually costs of this production are greater than market sees. And the quantity produced, this is also a kind of overproduction because market ignores some of the costs. So you can see the externality here in this graph. A similar situation will happen when some benefits are ignored. So these would be positive externalities here. If I am vaccinated against some fever, some disease, then I will not be ill with this disease, but also I will not pass this disease on you. So when we think about vaccination, this is my benefit that we talk about, but this is also your benefit. If I am to be vaccinated, then I have to pay for that. So I pay for my benefit. And how about you? Do you pay for the benefit that you get from my vaccination? Well, you don't. So as you can see, markets may ignore some benefits they are not paid for. What is this problem about here? Well, demand will be lower than it should be because the benefits are lower than they should be. And the price will be too low. Is it a problem? Well, not necessarily if that was only the problem of too low price, but this too low price will result also in insufficient production that is also too low. So as you can see, when you look at markets from a broader social perspective, then sometimes when externalities exist, you may find that market-derived solutions are not optimal for the society. By the way, would you be able to find deadweight loss in both situations, in this slide and in the previous one? Here again, in this graph, you can find externality as the difference, the vertical difference between marginal private benefits and marginal social benefits. What are the remedies for externalities? Can we do something about this kind of market failure? Well, yes, we can. Actually, if some costs or benefits are external, we should try to make them internal. We should try to make market notice them. So there are some remedies proposed. You can see 4 of them. Private remedies based on the Coase Theorem, command and control remedies, taxes and subsidies, and tradable permits. We are going to discuss them briefly. The Coase Theorem. It says that private negotiations may be a solution to externalities based on 2 assumptions: that property rights are clearly defined and negotiations are costless. Let's imagine the following situation. Dr. Jekyll is a neighbor of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde wants to play loud music. Dr. Jekyll does not like this idea, likes to enjoy silence. Let's consider a few scenarios here. Scenarios A, or A1. Dr. Jekyll owns the right to silence. And this right to silence represents some value to him. Let it be 500. Mr. Hyde wants to play music and values this kind of entertainment at 600. Well, can they solve their problem? Can they make a certain deal? Yes, they can, obviously. Dr. Jekyll may consider selling his right to Mr. Hyde. So, if Dr. Jekyll values his right as 500 and Mr. Hyde wants to play music and values this idea at 600, they can negotiate the price. So for instance, at 540 there would be 40 of producer surplus for Dr. Jekyll, 60 of consumer surplus for Mr. Hyde, and the total economic surplus here would be 100. The difference between what Dr. Jekyll wants to get for his right, the minimum, and what Mr. Hyde wants to pay for the right to playing the music, and this is at most 600. Scenario A2. Let's imagine that negotiations are not costless anymore. Let's involve a lawyer. If the lawyer is involved and he charges 50 for negotiations between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, then it is still possible to get the solution. For instance, they could both give up a little bit of their producer and consumer surplus and pay this money to a lawyer. Remember that economic surplus, so the difference between what one of them needs to get and what the other one is willing to pay, is 100. So if the lawyer charges below 100, they can still make a deal. What if the lawyer charges more than 100? Oh, that would kill the deal. There is no possible compromise between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde if the lawyer is necessary and if the lawyer charges more than 100. Hence, costless negotiations are so important for Coase Theorem to work. If negotiations are costless, we can always make a deal if it is kind of reasonable to make a deal at all. What does it mean if it's reasonable? Consider scenario B. Mr. Hyde wants to play music and he values this at 600 as previously. But this time let's think of Dr. Jekyll owning the right to silence and valuing this right to silence at 700. there will be no deal here. Mr. Hyde cannot buy the right to silence from Dr. Jekyll, but that's okay. That's okay because to Mr. Hyde, this pleasure of having loud music is not as important as silence is important to Dr. Jekyll. So that's okay. Scenario C. What if that is Mr. Hyde who has the right to make noise? Can we apply Coase Theorem here? Think carefully. And scenario D. Consider the following situation. It is unclear who has the right to silence or who has the right to noise. Could we apply Coase Theorem in this situation? Command and control, that's another remedy for externalities. So there could be some restrictions or regulations that are placed by the government on individuals or on firms. We can see that in the form of scrubbers in smokestacks, or we can see that in carbon dioxide emission limits that are made for cars. Economists are pretty skeptical about command and control as a remedy for externalities. They say that, first of all, this kind of restrictions or regulations do not produce any incentives to move beyond the level that was set. So, for instance, if we produce some carbon dioxide emission norms for cars, as soon as producers will be able to produce cars that meet this limit, that satisfy this limit, they will have no further incentives to innovate and to create better cars. Taxes and subsidies are believed to perform better. We can try to find solution for correcting negative externalities using the so-called Pigovian tax. What is that about? Well, imagine the market where we have supply and demand, and obviously we've got equilibrium here with PE and QE as equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. If there is externality in production of those goods, we can simply apply a tax that is equal to the negative externality produced by this business. If we do so, then we will shift the supply curve to the left, and the vertical distance between supply and supply prim would be the reflection of the negative externality that we have. That would produce the new equilibrium. As you can see, quantities are smaller, prices are higher. So this is how we correct for negative externality. We make market see the externality by including this externality into the Pigovian tax. Apart from Pigovian taxes, we can also speak of Pigovian subsidies. So that would be correcting for positive externalities. And there are two options here. We can subsidize the supply side and we can subsidize the demand side. Let's look at the supply side situation first. So we've got supply, we've got demand, and we've got the equilibrium resulting from the location of those two curves. And then we subsidize the supply. It's like a negative tax, you know. It shifts the supply curve to the right. This kind of Pigovian subsidy is Pigovian, as it comes from the name of Pigou, which was a famous economist. This type of Pigovian subsidy would change the equilibrium in the market, pushing markets towards greater production and lower prices. Another idea is the idea of subsidizing the demand side. So we've got market again, equilibrium again, and now we subsidize the demand side. That would shift demand to the right, pushing the market into new equilibrium with greater production and higher price. As you can see, if we use subsidizing, whether we subsidize demand side or supply side, both would lead to greater quantities. The difference between those two ways of subsidizing is influence on prices. When we subsidize demand, prices would grow. When we subsidize supply, prices would fall. So, which type of subsidies is more often present in our reality? Well, it could be thought that the supply side should be used more often because it offers lower prices. Actually, it is probably more popular to see the demand side subsidies in action. This is mostly due to the fact that it is politically easier. I mean, you give money to people, not to producers. And this is the optics of the voters and politicians. Politicians prefer giving money to people rather than to businesses. This is better perceived. Actually, as you can see, if you subsidize demand, then prices would grow. And the last remedy for externalities are the so-called tradable permits. This is a real hit. I mean, economists are pretty proud of that because this is an example of a so-called artificial market, where we can use a market mechanism to control things that are quite complicated and not very likely to be handled by markets. So the idea here is we have a certain level of, let's say, carbon dioxide emission. Let's call this level N. And we decide to reduce it by 20%. Hence, we make just 80% of N available for businesses. We can issue permits for them, and we can give those permits, or we can sell those permits to them. Everyone gets the permit allowing to emit 80% of what they emitted so far. So what happens next? Businesses must cut down production unless they can change technology. So there is an incentive here, right, to change the technology. It is possible for some businesses to reduce their emission and do not change production. Actually, if they could have their production unchanged and reduce their emission by more than 20%, they would have some spare permits that they don't really need. Permits are tradable, so they can be sold. If you can develop a technology that allows you to cut down not 20% but 50% your emission, then you make money on additional tradable permits you don't need. Valuable production that is valuable for the society, will survive this kind of cut down on emission. Why is that so? Valuable production, the one that produces high profits for producers, allows them actually to buy permits from others. So there could be a group of businesses that change their technology to cut down on carbon dioxide emission. There could be a group of producers that offer valuable production that would buy those spare permits from others. And this kind of production that is not very valuable, actually, that may be eliminated. So we can reach our goal of decreasing the emission level mostly at the cost of the least valuable production. So that is a kind of real hit here. The major problem with tradable permits is the fact that we do not have any perfect granting scheme. Imagine, for instance, how would you distribute those tradable permits among different countries in the European Union. We may decide as the European Union that we reduce carbon dioxide emission level by 20%, but then how many tradable permits should be made available to each country? That would be really problematic. Per person, not necessarily, right? According to the production, proportional to the production, that could be doubtful. Some countries rely more on carbon dioxide emissions simply because they are cold. So you need to burn something to survive the winter. That's not the case in those countries that enjoy better climate. Some economies rely quite heavily on coal. Others rely on nuclear powers, for instance. That makes things complicated. Nevertheless, tradable permits are really good for making externalities less painful for the economy, less significant a problem. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you very much.